Today we're taking a look at using the Toon shader in Redshift for 3ds Max to create this art style that looks like it could be from a high-contrast graphic novel or something. First, a high-speed summary. If you already know about tone mapping and stuff, all I'm really adding to the conversation here is that in 3ds Max, you gotta set it up using the Redshift contour material, and have a Redshift Toon material plugged into that as its surface. Then a standard gradient ramp is good to control the base tone map. And you can get a cool effect by adding a Redshift ambient occlusion to the base color with the spread set to 0 and the fall off to like 20. So that's pretty much everything. So from here on out will be the deep dive where I'll say pretty much that same stuff in 10 minutes rather than 20 seconds. There are already some solid tutorials for toon shading out there. I learned from watching Grayscale Gorilla's video on watercolor toon shading with Redshift, which covers most of what I'm going to talk about here, but I wanted to translate it for users working in 3ds Max instead of Cinema 4D or Blender. Before we start, if you're following along, make sure your version of Redshift is generally up to date. I'm using version 2026.2.1. Okay, first we need a scene to render. I'll just do a quick time-lapse building a robot character from parts in my kit-bashing junkyard. Okay, we'll pretend that's how that happened. First, some render setup. I'll change to a Redshift renderer and set the quality to low for now. I'll also disable global illumination since this is going to be a flat stylized look and I don't want light bouncing around realistically in my scene. Now we want to disable color management. Like, check out this sports logo. By default, the system adjusts the colors when rendering to look better with physically based lights and materials, but the resulting colors don't match with the original, which is unacceptable for a professional brand like this. So let's go to Rendering, Color Management, and change it from OCIO to Unmanaged. Then I'll hit F9 to render a quick shot, and in the Render View window, expand it until I see the little gear icon, and make sure the view is set to sRGB and RAW. Next, I'll open the Material Editor, and I'm just going to click on any color swatch to get the color picker, and let's disable the color management switch here too. Now our colors should pass through almost perfectly to the rendering. Finally, I'm just going to set my background to white so we can see the outlines that are going to be black. Redshift gets its background settings from the rendering menu under Effects, Redshift tab, and go down to the background section. Now that we're set up, let's look at creating the actual material. In our Slate Material Editor, let's drag out a new RS Toon material and apply it to the objects in our scene. I'll start an IPR render so we can see it in action as we make changes. We need a light to interact with our material. I'll make a Redshift physical light and change it from area to directional. At first glance it might look like it's doing a cartoon shading thing, but it's actually just way too bright. I'll turn its intensity down from 100 to maybe 3 and rotate it to a good direction. A good light position will highlight the most important parts of your scene and make the surfaces look interesting rather than flat and boring. Our Toon shader is just acting like a normal surface right now though, so let's toonify it back in the Material Editor. First, set the reflection weight to 0. Next, let's plug a gradient ramp into our base tone map. For now, I'll just set the interpolation to solid and make it a medium gray and a light gray. If you're not familiar with Toon shading, the way it basically works is your lights and surfaces work together to make a grayscale source image. The Toon shader then remaps those black and white values to a different color output for the final render. Tone mapping is nice because it automatically overrides the shading so you don't have to manually set it up as self-illuminating or emissive. But anyway, this gradient is where you can mess around with the look of your surfaces. You can pull the dark colors back to just the darkest areas, or have them cover most of the model. You can use multiple tones or colors, and move your light around to get all kinds of different looks. And going back to the previous point, since your tone mapping is being applied to a base lighting gradient, you want to make sure you're working with good source lighting. If your light is blown out, it will only be picking up the color at the black and white ends of your gradient, and if it's too dark, it might not even show all the colors you have. But a nice full gradient of light from near black to near white will distribute the colors nice and evenly across your surfaces. I also want to point out, even though we're not going to use it right now, that this base tone map is also where you can plug in a Redshift tone map pattern to get cool halftone and pattern surface effects. But I just want a simple surface, so I'll keep mine as the solid gradient colors. Of course, the most important part of a good Toon shader is the outlines. To help demonstrate this next part, I'm going to select the Toon material and set its base color weight to 0 and the emission amount to 1, which will override the surface colors. Now I'll add a new RS contour material, and we will plug our entire Toon material into this one as the surface. When we assign this new material to our objects, we'll immediately begin seeing some outlines in our rendering. The contour is where we control all the outline settings. It treats both the internal and external outlines separately, which is really nice because external outlines are almost always a little thicker in graphic artwork. I'll start with a thickness of 25 for my externals and 5 for my internals. We can give our outlines a color, but for this style I'm going to leave them black. We can have it pick up more internal details by playing around with the angle threshold. As I decrease the angle from 180 to 90 to 45, 30, and even lower, you can see it go from not enough detail to way too much detail. I think 45 looks pretty good. Simple outlines like these can look great, but we can add variation by plugging maps into the thickness modifiers. Here are two styles I think look really good. First, let's use a standard falloff and plug it into both the external and internal thickness modifiers. We'll set the falloff type to towards away, and for the falloff direction we'll use the world Z axis. We can then either lighten up our black color or bring up the dark end of our curve mix to dial it in so lines don't completely disappear, but are still heavier on the underside of shapes and lighter on the top, which is one kind of standard way of rendering lines in some graphic styles. Let's try a different style. Scrap the falloff and instead use a max on noise. To help us get a feel for it, let's first plug this into our surface's emission color. I'm seeing that my noise is scaled differently across my sub-objects. The best way to fix that would be to reset transforms on everything, but since I'm not animating, I'll just change it to use world coordinates and set my overall scale to 75. There are lots of crazy noise types to try out, but I like to just use the simple turbulent style with the contrast bumped up to about 0.8. We're looking close enough, so I'll remove this map from the surface emission and plug it into both the internal and external thickness modifiers over here in the contour. We can continue making adjustments now that we can see it on the outlines. I'll bring up my blacks a little bit so the outlines don't completely disappear, but it still has some variation, like they were drawn loosely by hand with a pen or something. We can also make it look like we used our outline pen to fill in some of the deepest gaps and shadows using ambient occlusion. Let's first preview it in our emission color, and then once it looks good we'll move it over to work with our surface colors. Let's make an RSAO node and plug it into our emission color. Now watch what happens when we take the spread down from 0.8 to 0 and increase the fall off to maybe 20. We get these super interesting black areas, and you can play with the max distance to tone it back a little bit. This looks good, so let's make it work with our lighting and surface shading instead of overriding it. Let's go into our surface Toon material, set the emission amount to 0 and the base color weight back to 1. Now simply move our emission color pin up into the base color spot. Now our ambient occlusion gets multiplied over our tone map surface colors without otherwise affecting the surface. A quick note, this only works if your ambient occlusion is black or if it looks good having it multiplied over top of your surface colors. If you want a pure color, I would leave it black in the diffuse color so it clears out any diffuse shading in those areas, and then use a duplicate as the emissive color and set that to blend from black to the actual color you want. Now all that's left is to get artsy with it and play around with stuff until you have the final look you want. We can go into the gradient for the main surface tone map to adjust our surface colors, and we can rotate our directional light to make different parts and details stand out. Here's another cool thing you can do. The ambient occlusion shadows by default are just a single color, but we can manually tone map them just like anything else. First we need a better source gradient to work with, so I'm going to bring my ambient occlusion falloff down to 0.5 so it has a gradual gradient to remap. Then make a new gradient ramp and plug our AO in as its source and connect that up again. We need to change it from generating a gradient to remapping the values from the source input, which we do by changing the gradient type from linear to mapped. Now I can set the colors to solid and maybe add a little splash of vibrant color in there just to add some interest to my picture. And maybe we want to give the background a color. If you're using a camera, you can override the global settings with a Redshift camera attributes modifier. For the final render, let's open our render setup or press F10. Since we're not doing much for realistic lighting or reflections, I found that using low or medium quality settings usually works great. Just set your final resolution and hit render. If you want to work on a background separately in Photoshop, set the background color to the same as your outline color and save it as a PNG file. Now you can open it in Photoshop and go crazy painting your own background. Thanks for watching and good luck on your next project.